This video is sponsored by Foldforge. More about them later on. The dust has settled on the 2025 World Championships of Warhammer, and we've crowned a new world champion for the coming year. This year saw some absolutely insane competition and ended up with Richard Siegler from Team Art of War taking down the entire event with a unique and aggressive take on Adeptus Mechanicus. So let's dive in and talk about exactly what he was running, his matchups, and the road he took to the World Championship. What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and all eyes in the world are pointed at Atlanta, Georgia this weekend to take a peek at the World Championships of Warhammer. First of all, a little about the event itself. In total, the event was running 8 rounds with an additional shadow round in order to cut to the top 4. Players were initially placed in pods, with their placement in the pods after round 4 determining whether or not they make it into the championship bracket. That championship bracket then played to a single undefeated at the end of round 8, a player who would be crowned the world champion. To this event, Richard Siegler took an Adeptus Mechanicus army from the Skitarii Hunter cohort detachment. Now, Adeptus Mechanicus has been on the competitive fringes for the last couple of seasons. However, in the most recent update, they got some enormous buffs, including the ability for Belisarius Call, their faction leader character, to point a full reroll effect at an enemy unit. Very similar to Oaths of Moment from Space Marines, you can now, if you choose that as his one ability for your command phase, target that at a specific enemy and then give your whole army rerolls against that enemy. When you're talking about units that have critical effects, things like sustained hits from Cognitus weapons or taser goads, that can make your army do incredible damage. Now, combined with the insane efficiency of units like Iron Strider Ballistari, this can give your army an immense amount of anti-tank punch without having to take too many points of dedicated anti-tank units, which allows the army to put the majority of its focus on units that control the board and control scoring. Now, Richard Siegler is probably the greatest Adeptus Mechanicus player of all time, and while he has been competing with the faction for the majority of the season, up until this point, they didn't necessarily have the numbers to consistently get to that upper echelon of competitive play. But now the training weights are off. He has emerged from the hyperbolic time chamber, and he is ready to take down a world championship with these new and improved mechanics.
Adeptus Mechanicus, as everybody knows, is my favorite army. I've played it for many years. Obviously, they got major buffs in September. Finally, they are an army that can do a good amount of damage. They've got the screens and the layers, so I was always going to play them even if they didn't get the buffs.
So, here is what the army is built to do. First of all, it's playing Skitarii Hunter cohort, which gives it a lot of additional survivability. Essentially, the entire army, all Skitarii infantry, mounted, and Iron Strider Ballistari units gain stealth. In addition, Sicarians, who make up the majority of the army's infantry, also gain cover if they are more than 12 inches away from enemies, regardless of whether or not they're actually in terrain. So, when we're discussing an army that's going to be composed almost entirely of these unit types, giving stealth to all of them, units that are already slightly difficult to kill, especially because on things like Sicarians, who have multiple wounds as well as protection from solid armor saves, they have a 4+ armor save, which means that they can shrug, especially once they're benefiting from that cover, a lot of the more dedicated anti-infantry sweepers that might be coming in at AP 0 or AP 1. A lot of those hits are going to go onto the base armor save or an improved armor save thanks to the benefit of cover and get shrugged. However, they also come with a 5+ invulnerable save, meaning that even high AP weapons, things like heavy plasma weapons that are firing massive multi-damage blast attacks, can get shrugged by that 5+. And anytime you don't kill one of the army's infantry units, that's another unit that's going to be able to range out, movement block you, secure more secondary objectives, or even contest your objectives for a turn. And many times, you can essentially scam your opponent by simply surviving in situations where mathematically you maybe should have gone down and continuously score. So, Skitarii Hunter cohort, generally speaking, ends up being very solid in the scoring department, and the buffs to its ranged damage output allows it to then counter heavy targets with that las cannon shooting. The army can compound that effect with stratagems like Shroud protocols, which make its infantry untargetable by enemies from outside 18 inches, Bionic Endurance to give any of its Sicarian, Taraxi, or Sidonian unit a 5+ feel no pain, and aggressive melee pushes from Expedited Purge protocol, which allows its Skitarii units, which essentially means any of the infantry in the army, to advance and charge. This video has been sponsored by the most impressive competitive terrain solution I've ever worked with, and that is Foldforge. Foldforge is a system of modular, disassemblable terrain features for Warhammer 40k and other tabletop miniature games. The system uses building walls that are printed in a high-resolution FDM printer, such that their components can fold and unfold, allowing for easy storage and quick assembly, with magnets that allow you to quickly assemble and disassemble. Using these folding wind tabs, they then lock together and create a robust terrain solution. The modular characteristic of these ruins allow them to flip from one side to another. So when you're playing something like a chapter-approved 2025 format, where depending on the deployment zone, the ruins may be flipped from one side to another, you can simply reassemble the structure on the fly in order to construct the second layout. This also means that most of these buildings can be linked together, which allows you to expand them out if you want more narrative play. On top of that, your Foldforge terrain set also comes in its own bespoke carry case. Each of the pieces has its own slot, so it's easy to remove from the case and repack back in. And with the ease of assembling the magnetized pieces, you can also set up an entire table in under 2 minutes. So say goodbye to overpacked closets and overflowing shelves, and say hello to Foldforge. Check them out in the links down in the video description to get your Foldforge today. Now, in the army proper, Richard was playing Belisarius Call. As you mentioned before, an incredible force multiplier for the team. The other thing he can do is increase the objective control characteristic of nearby Adeptus Mechanicus units, which allows you to retain control of objectives, even in situations where you might not normally have maintained control of them. We also have a Skitarii Marshal with Cantic Thrallnet, which gives him the ability to lock in both Conqueror and Protector Imperative for a Skitarii unit within 12 inches. This is important because you can select this for your Iron Strider Belistari, meaning that regardless of the imperative that your units are currently in, you can ensure that your Iron Striders can always benefit from Protector Doctrina so that they get +1 to hit. In a pinch, if your army is already benefiting from Protector Imperative, you can give one of your other units Conqueror Imperative to give them Advance and Shoot. The Iron Striders, however, always fall back, Advance and Shoot as normal. Now, moving on to the actual units, we have 2 units of Skitarii Rangers. These guys have Scout, they have Objective Secured, so they're a good battle line unit which can turn on the battle line synergies from the army ability, but they're also good as a scoring unit. Especially in situations where the objectives may be close to your deployment zones, you can threaten to range out and take a forward objective, lock it under your control, and then simply leave the scene of the crime in order to force your opponent to expose units to take it that you can then kill with your own ranged attacks. From there, the list is entirely composed of Iron Striders and Sicarian infantry. This includes 3 units of Iron Strider Balistari. Importantly, 2 of them were running twin Cognis las cannons for anti-tank purposes. These are twin-linked sustained hits, strength 12, AP3, D6 +1 damage, normal las cannon profile shots, which, as you can imagine, when benefited from +1 to hit from Protector Imperative and full hit rerolls from Belisarius Call, alongside those sustained hits 1, become incredibly consistent, rerolling both their hit and wound rolls. The Cognis autocannons shoot more times, but with lower value, at only strength 9, AP1, 3 damage. This allows this particular unit to be better in an anti-infantry role. That's incredibly important because having a high volume attack allows the army to cut angles, especially since these guys are relatively fast and can advance and shoot, to shoot down enemy utility units without having to dedicate any of their melee threats in order to do so. So, for example, if you put 5 Space Marine Scouts, something that the Cognis las cannons might not have the attack volume to deal with, but a unit like Sicarian Rust Stalkers is too high value to actually commit, you can cut a line with the Iron Strider Balistari, ping that line to a single scout, and then hopefully rip that unit off the table without having to expose your army. And a lot of Siegler's gameplay was about maintaining his pieces on the board in order to win the game on round 5.
Huge thing is I expected Admech to be quite prevalent because it got serious buffs. I expected Sisters to be prevalent and Aeldari. So I wanted a list that was good into all 3 of those. If I happen to play other armies, it is what it is. But the main tech that I brought in was the autocannon Iron Striders. They are a devastating damage into any 3 wound bodies, but also they just have the volume, much more volume than the las cannons. So I have a unit I can buff and keep alive and trade out the las cannons if I don't need them.
Next up are units of Tyranxes Skystalkers. These aren't Sicarians per se, but they do have the Sicarian defensive profile with 2 wounds, a 4+ save at toughness 4 with a 5+ invulnerable save. They come packing 6-shot flechette carbines and the ability to move after shooting, up to potentially 12 inches if they can do so near battle line units. This gives you a ton of units that are ridiculously fast. With Conquer Imperative, you're able to move them 12 plus D6 inches thanks to advancing, then fire their weapons and move an additional 12 inches, moving a potential 30 inches in a single turn, 10, and with those units of 10, you could be putting 10 objective control characteristic on an enemy objective. You can also use them to screen enemies, take over areas of the battlefield, score secondaries, or simply jail them and corral them into their own deployment zone with the sheer mass of bodies. In addition to that, you also have an up-down stratagem in this detachment, allowing you to pay a CP to put any of your Skitarii infantry into reserve. Taraxi Skystalkers having natural deep strike then allows them to deep strike on the battlefield later on, which makes your early game secondary scoring much more reliable. But in addition, because they can move after shooting, it allows you to place those guys next to an objective, fire their weapons, and then move on to the objective to take it. So if your opponent isn't screening heavily, you're going to be able to steal their objectives from them, even through units that would normally be controlling it. From there, we also have 3 units of Sicarian infiltrators. These guys are able to gum up the middle of the table by infiltrating a mass of 40mm based, relatively fast objective controlling infantry. While they don't have the same speed as Sicarian Rust Stalkers, infiltrators are able to use their forward operation to stage themselves from the very beginning of the game into relevant positions, and then advance and charge with their above average movement characteristic to get onto your opponent's objectives. This forces your opponent to overcommit into killing them because, as we talked about before, between stealth, potentially the benefit of cover while in the open, and a 5+ feel no pain, or shroud protocols to make them difficult to shoot at, even if these infiltrators are playing hyper aggressively, your opponent has to overcommit to kill them, and they aren't that many points per model.
The other tech that was really helpful was 30 infiltrators. Normally I've been doing 10-5-5. Here I built and painted some extra ones leading into the event to get 30 because they have all the pistol shots, they have all the combat attacks. They're really good at all these T3 armies. They just rip them apart, and then defensively I have 25 Skystalkers to move block, and then I have 30 infiltrators, and you charge into a protector army with -1 to hit in melee, stealth, 5 of Feel Pain that forces battle shocks on you. There's so many swing moments where you could heroic, force a battle shock, take an objective back, so I had a lot of traps set up.
If the Sicarian infiltrators do get the drop on you, they're able to charge, something that Belisarius' Call has given you rerolls to. They have sustained hits to in melee on their AP1 taser goads. So they're still going to be able to do some pretty serious damage, especially against infantry or light vehicles. On top of that, they are also rocking flechette blasters, firing 5 shots per model. So when we are putting all of this together, and this is going to be very relevant, we can see that these Taraxi units are firing almost 60 shots. They do lose a shot because their alpha says a slightly worse weapon, but the Sicarian infiltrators are also able to fire 50 attacks. So each of these units, despite the fact that they are relatively low strength, low damage, low AP, can blast shots into lightly armored enemies. And when we are considering that some of the other best armies in the metagame right now are things like Tau Empire or Aeldari, units that can fire this mass of strength 3 shots are incredibly powerful because so many of these armies are reliant on light infantry, units with a 4+ or a 5+ save that are only toughness 3. This allows units like Sicarian infiltrators, if they're in Conquer Imperative, to run up, kill a unit with their shooting, charge a second unit, and kill that as well with their melee attacks before putting almost 10 OC onto an enemy objective to disrupt your opponent's scoring. If you're able to do this 3 times for relatively low cost, it's incredibly difficult to get ahead of this army on scoring in a normal situation. From there, we also have a unit of Sicarian Rust Stalkers. Typically, we see them taking Transonic Blades, a mass attack devastating wound weapon, which allows them to punch mass mortal wounds through even high defenses. However, in this case, Richard was actually taking the Transonic Razor and Cord Claw. This gives them an AP2 2 damage weapon with anti-infantry 3. However, it lacks devastating wounds, and it has a significantly lower attack volume than the Transonic Blades option. This does give the Rust Stalkers a little bit more hitting power into high armor save enemies, something that the Sicarian infiltrators will bounce up into. And given the fact that the Rust Stalkers, especially if they are being put into Conqueror Imperative, are going to be fairly effective into most lighter units anyway, they don't necessarily need the mass attacks, it's fine to take a higher damage, higher AP weapon, especially if you're in a situation where you are very confident in your ability to take out light infantry with the enormous attack volume that you have from the infiltrators and the Skystalkers. Being able to shore up matches against things like heavy to medium infantry, so enemies like 10 Space Marines or Terminators, is certainly helpful and can help take some of the pressure off of the trio of Iron Strider units to whom that task would normally be granted. The Sicarian Rust Stalkers are always an incredible inclusion in detachments like Skitarii Hunter Cohort or Halo Screed Battleclade, where they have access to advance and charge because they have access to both an advance and a charge bonus. They're naturally +1 to advance and charge, and can be +2 to advance and charge if you do so near battle line units, giving them a total of +4 inches to their threat range. So this, in addition to those Taraxi, gives the army even more aggressive push. While the infiltrators can hold down your side of the table, the Ruststalkers do have to start in your deployment zone, but can force their threat range almost 12 inches plus their advance and charge rolls. They're moving 8 base inches, +2 for their advance bonus, +2 for their charge bonus, plus 3d6, giving them an average charge range of around 23 inches. You can basically start in your deployment zone and be threatening your opponent's deployment zone on the top of turn 1 by just spending 1 command point. Now, Richard tended to play this army very conservatively. He pushed forward to things like the Infiltrators and the Taraxi Skystalkers to ensure that his opponents were relatively low on primary score, while retaining most of his powerful units in his own on his home objectives for the majority of the game. Now, for an army that is built like this, that looks like it might try to just jail you into your deployment zone with masses of infiltrating units and fast melee threats, you would think that the way to play it would be to play aggressively and try to force them all down your opponent's throat. But he tended to follow his traditional playstyle, which is to take a much more analytical approach and ensure that he has the material left at the end of the game to beat his opponent's score, regardless of what they had remaining. So, as long as he could construct a situation where he was scoring a baseline number of points and could deny his opponent points to catch him towards the end of the game, he could then reveal all of his remaining infantry and Iron Striders and construct a board state where it was mathematically impossible for his opponent to win. And that style of very cagey play actually won him a lot of really, really tight situations. So let's talk about exactly what his matchups were and how he did during each of his games. Now, some of these matchups were streamed when we were able to take a look at exactly how those matchups went down. However, in some of them, we don't have live video footage of them, so we're just going to be going on what the matchup looked like from the outside looking in. And that includes round 1, where Siegler played Purge the Foe against an Aeldari Warhost. This was up against Adolfo Villarreal from Mexico, and Richard was able to take this one down 100 to 30. Now, Aeldari, I think, is a very playable matchup for this particular style of Adeptus Mechanicus. One thing that Aeldari wants to do is it wants to focus fire on big, heavy units that it can kill, then use its fire and fate effects, especially in Warhost, to hide away from opponents' counterattacks, and then sort of sandpaper you for value that way. In this case, with this Adeptus Mechanicus army being composed how it is, there aren't really any huge, particularly valuable bricks for the Eldar to get their teeth sunk into. Instead, they have to continuously make trades down, where Aspect Warrior units go into units of Skitari or Taraxi or Sicarians and kill some but not all of them, then die and just donate value to the Adeptus Mechanicus side. There's no real way for an Eldar army to get their teeth into an army that's composed like this in a way where they can get a lot of valuable trades. In addition to that, Purge the Foe is a nightmare here. Most of Siegel's units are large units with bunches of wounds, which means they don't go down very quickly, and he doesn't have to expose many of them in order to gain value, whereas Eldar are generally composed of lighter units of 5 models, which, as we talked about before, most of these Sicarian units can shoot to death and then charge and kill a second one, meaning even if they lose, Richard's going to be up on kills. And because Purge the Foe is the only mission that scores based on kills in addition to objective control, that gives the Adeptus Mechanicus a huge leg up here. So it's no doubt that he won that one 100 to 30. Now, with that, we're going to move over to round 2, where he played against Stefan Meertens from the Netherlands, running Space Wolves in a Stormlands task force. Now, this one was on Linchpin, which is a much more cagey scenario. Stefan was playing 2 units of Thunderwolf Cavalry, backed up by a lot of aggressive melee infantry. Now, that infantry is stuff that Richard can activate efficiently into, and he does have a pretty solid profile matchup with things like Sicarian Infiltrators into Thunderwolf Cavalry. They're Strength 6 into a Toughness 6 body, which is good, AP 1 into a 4+ invulnerable save, which is also good. There is Armor of Contempt that could be thrown in there, but obviously that's going to cost the Space Wolf player resources. However, I do think that the Iron Striders are going to be more efficient than the equivalent anti-tank pieces that Space Wolves are taking, and because they are relatively high volume, they can even activate into units like Terminators or like Thunderwolf Cavalry and still potentially do a lot of damage. With Richard being able to make these trades in the early game and potentially bait in expensive units of Thunderwolf Cavalry that he can then kill with his own counterattack, it makes sense to me that he would be able to win towards the late game once the Space Wolf aggression had been curtailed. From there, we moved on to round 3, where Richard was playing against Aeldari once again, and this might be a little bit of a theme throughout this World Championships. In this case, he was playing against Simon Baines, who was running, of all things, an Aeldari Seer Council. Now, this is the Psyker-focused Aeldari Detachment that gives it fate dice that you're able to spend on gaining stratagems for free. It does give you a modicum of additional maneuverability, especially with its ability to teleport units around the table during its own movement phase. And it was using this to teleport units like 10 Dark Reapers and multiple smaller units of Fire Dragons around to, as we talked about before, try to knock out big, heavy targets. Now, while I imagine something like the Dark Reapers could be very dangerous, they do ignore the stealth and the cover gained by the Skitarii Hunter cohort detachment ability, and with their ability to hop around the battlefield, they can get lines of sight where you might not be expecting them. The Taraxi are incredibly good at screening out this style of play. Because they can move so quickly, especially with the ability to deep strike them, shoot, and then move to get them even farther up the table, they can prevent those units from getting lines of sight into the more valuable bricks. And again, anything from an Aeldari army that goes into those units is largely going to be trading down if it kills those targets at all. There were a lot of Warlock Conclaves in this case, which are very dangerous once they are combined into a single unit. Their Destructor Torrents get incredibly powerful, but because of their low toughness characteristic and bad saves, as soon as they get engaged by things like the Rust Stalkers or the Sicarians, they are going to be picked up in great numbers. So it seems to me like this style of MSU Eldar is just running into its worst nightmare in the form of Skitarii Hunter cohort, and Richard was able to take that one down 96 to 54. Now that moves us on to round 4, where Richard was playing Kit Smith Hanna, another prevalent US player. In this case, Richard was going first against Dark Angels. Kit was playing an interesting variety of Dark Angels. It was an Iron Storm Spearhead, taking a bunch of vehicles. This included some Dark Angel specific vehicles like Land Speeder Vengeances, as well as Redemptor Dreadnoughts and Storm Speeder Thunderstrikes, being backed up by multiple Tech Marines and fueled by Azrael, who can offset the cost of those otherwise normally very expensive Iron Storm Spearhead stratagems. Now, Richard was going first here, and the reason that that's relevant is that round 4 used Scorched Earth. This mission tends to very heavily benefit the player going second. So in this case, Kit Smith, because you're able to perform an action to destroy objectives. That action usually completes at the end of your opponent's turn, meaning that they have a full turn to try to prevent you from completing the action. If you are going second on the 5th battle round, that action completes upon the end of the game, so immediately after your turn has concluded. This allows you to play very cagey, hold back, and prevent your opponent from scoring out. Then, at the end of the game, simply hold 2 objectives and then declare that you're going to destroy one of those 2, and you score 10 or so points above what your opponent has. It's incredibly easy to do if the game stalls out. However, it seems like Richard has practiced quite a bit in this particular seat, going first into a mission that tends to be very second player favored, because he was able to go first and win this matchup. Now, the Dark Angels army had a very low capacity to hold objectives. A lot of its units were just vehicles that were single entity units that were relatively low OC, and units like Sicarian Infiltrators and Taraxi could probably rush up and prevent them from getting a lead early. In addition to that, if Richard is using things like the Taraxi to move block very heavily, he can prevent units like the Redemptor Dreadnoughts from getting out of their deployment zone and getting a foothold in the center of the battlefield that allows him to actually threaten to hold multiple objectives by using Shroud protocols to prevent the Dark Angel's attacks from shooting into him. As soon as he clears out things like the Landspeeder Vengeances, there's very little in the way that can cross the middle of the table and actually engage with Richard's backline, so he's going to be able to score more consistently. Now, obviously, Dark Angels are able to come back in the late game thanks to the bottom round 5 scoring bonus, and they did make the game relatively close, scoring 72 points to Richard's 85, but the primary objective control of the Adeptus Mechanicus was able to see Richard through to the win. That put him into round 5 against Jack Murphy, another US player. Now, Jack is an incredible player and tends to play a wide variety of strong armies. However, today he was playing Adeptus Mechanicus, and if there is a single player that I would not want to hit in the Adeptus Mechanicus mirror, thanks to their superior matchup knowledge in a perfect mirror match, it would be Richard Siegler. So this was probably a bit of a nightmare matchup for Jack. Now, this mission was on Hidden Supplies, which is a much more standard scoring mission than the Scorched Earth we just talked about, and Jack had a very similar variety of Skitarii Hunter cohort to what Richard was playing. In his case, he was focused a little bit more heavily on his Rangers by taking a Battlesphere uplink Skitarii Marshal, as as well as taking, instead of infiltrators, more expensive rust stalkers. That gave Richard a higher unit count advantage on the battlefield, which I'm sure helped. But the other thing, too, is that Richard had in his army a unit of autocannon Iron Strider Ballistari, whereas Jack had all las cannon Iron Striders. And while those las cannons are effective against the other Iron Striders, they are not so effective against the mass Sicarian and Taraxi infantry, whereas those autocannons are. With their high volume and sustained hits and multi-damage, they're able to knock out 4 or 5 Sicarians in a single salvo. So in the case that Richard didn't play aggressively with his Iron Striders and didn't offer the trade with Jack's equivalents on the other side of the table, he was simply going to be more effective at dealing with his opponent's lower count of units, which by the end of the game could end up in a pretty solid attrition swing. That was an 80 to 66 point win that qualified Richard to play in the quarterfinals. And he was paired with fellow Art of War team member Jack Harpster, who was playing Adeptus Sororitas. And unfortunately for us, this game was also on supply drop. Now, this is one of the most polarizing missions of the entire Chapter Proof 2025 packet. Player going second has a massive advantage in this particular mission. Over the course of the game, the objectives in the center of the battlefield will slowly start to disappear, and the remaining objectives, as they do so, will become more and more valuable. This allows the final objective on the board to be worth 3 times as much as a standard objective. And with the second player scoring at the end of their turn, all they had to do is push their army into that single objective and score 15 points, which is likely more than the first player can score over the entirety of the game in order to win in the late game. Now, Jack was playing a Champions of the Faith variety of Adeptus Sororitas. This does tend to be an Adeptus Mechanicus favored matchup. It certainly can go poorly for Mechanicum, especially when we consider how resilient and hard-hitting units like Celestian Sacrosants are, especially since they're running 2 damage weapons in this case, which are great at killing opposing Sicarian units. Now, it seemed like Jack was cognizant of this and packed a lot of anti-infantry weapons alongside his anti-tank. He had several Retributor squads to pack multi-melta shooting to deal with heavily armored targets, but he was also playing units like Sanctifiers and Flamer-equipped Dominions. The downside here is that Jack ended up going first. He has a very aggressive list. He's able to scout forward with his Dominion squads, add additional movement to them with the Champions of Faith Detachment ability, and get them into their opponent's deployment zone very early. Obviously, with units of 10 Sicarians, it's a little difficult to actually take them down with AP0 Flamers from the Dominion squad, so while you can do some significant damage to them, you're not going to necessarily kill entire units, and you're mostly threatening Overwatch or trying to kill opposing utility squads. The 10 Model 20 wound strong Sicarian units are resilient against those AP0 Flamer weapons. So while Jack did have the speed to push up into the Mechanicum deployment zone early, he didn't necessarily have the staying power to do much while he was there. So he was forced to push forward in order to attempt to get a lead on attrition early, because otherwise if he waits the game out until round 5, Richard's going to push everything to the center objective on that round 5 and then win. So he ended up playing very aggressively and ended up being punished for it. We should also mention, of course, that things like the mass shooting from the Taraxi and the Infiltrators are going to be incredibly useful here, despite the fact that the Sisters are mostly on 3+ or better saves, and while there are -1 to wound effects on things like the Celestian Sacrosants, the other units will drop to that massive volume of fire, and once they start going down, it's just up to the Sacrosants to deal with an unending tide of Sicarian Infiltrators who will eventually beat them. And unfortunately, with that aggressive play, Jack wasn't able to sustain the game out to the bitter end, which allowed Siegler to advance to the semifinals 68 to 45. Now, in that semifinal round, he was up against a very interesting matchup. This was Giorgio Castelli running Deathwatch from Italy. Now, Richard did go second in this game, but it was playing Take and Hold, which is a much more standard scoring game. Now, Giorgio was playing a Black Spear task force that had a couple of interesting inclusions. This included multiple Fortis kill teams, so he had some pretty solid indirect fire going down, as well as a pair of Indomitor kill teams that could deal with heavy armor, with their potentially extended range Melta attacks and heavy bolter attacks thanks to Kraken ammunition. Now, the downside here is that, like we talked about with Aeldari, Deathwatch wants to single out a particular target that they can sink their teeth into and really alpha strike and get rid of before they attrition out the rest of the game. What they want to try to do is open the game by firing indirect and skirmishing a little bit with the opponent, forcing them to bring out their big heavy units, and then they can use site-to-site teleportation to pull their Indomitor kill teams into reserve, drop them back down on whatever that big target is and blow it up, and then roll out to a win from there. But when we're talking about an army that's composed of basically 60 Sicarians, there's not really anything that fits that description. position. They are the Iron Strider units who have no reason to ever reveal themselves before the big heavy Indomitor kill teams drop in, and then everything else is just 5 or 10 2-wound infantry models. And while this army is incredibly good at killing those 2-wound infantry models, it does have a Centurion Devastator squad that can use site-to-site teleport to hop around and fire its mass Centurion missile launchers to knock out those big units as well. Richard can use Shroud protocols to protect himself from these units while screening out the Indomitor kill teams from getting a bead on his objectives. This forced Giorgio to aggressively deploy his units with site-to-site teleportation, and he doom dropped early in the game to try to kill as much of the Sicarian units as he could. And while he did do that, that left him open to the Iron Strider Ballistari, and towards the late game, Richard was able to roll over the battlefield with those Iron Striders, each one of them killing several Indomitor kill team members per turn until the Deathwatch army was basically tabled. Giorgio did mention that if he had not gone first and was not staring down the barrel of, again, Richard holding units like the Traxi Skystalkers and the Rust Stalkers in quote-unquote reserve behind ruins and in safe positions where they could just push out for round 5 and win the game on bottom right 5 scoring, he wouldn't have felt so much pressure to push forward early, but in that case he did and ended up being punished for it. And that brought Richard to the final game, round 8, against Liam VSL, the LGT champion and widely considered one of, if not the best player in the world. This was live streamed by the Warhammer 40k main channel, and oh my god, what an insane finals it was. Now, this was on Scorched Earth a second time. And as I mentioned before, Scorched Earth is incredibly second player favored for all the reasons I talked about previously. However, it seems like Richard has practiced ad nauseum play into these really difficult to win game states where your opponent has a huge advantage based on the scoring mechanics of the game, and it's up to you to navigate your way out strategically by retaining your resources and pushing them in the later turns. In this case, Richard played ultra conservatively in the early game. He was able to force his opponent to push forward some resources, things like Warp Spiders, Striking Scorpion Squads, and Eldar Rangers, to move block and to disrupt control of Richard's objectives. Liam's Fire Dragons, the biggest and beefiest unit in his army, came out really early to try to threaten Belisarius Call, who was on one flank, and try to knock down a unit of Iron Strider Belisari. Unfortunately, the Iron Striders with baked-in stealth and access to Feel No Pains are very difficult for the Fire Dragons to kill if they aren't in Melta range, and Richard was very careful to ensure that they could not gain Melta range with their fusion guns onto those Iron Striders. The Iron Striders end up living, and Richard is able to kill the Eldar Wave Serpent early before using the mass Strength 3 shooting that his army has access to kill everything in the transport, including Fuegan, who did not respawn, which was a huge swing. That meant that the biggest and beefiest and scariest unit on the Eldar side, while it is relatively inefficient against things like Sicarians, it is still a powerful piece and the most expensive thing in the Eldar army. That was removed from the table almost instantaneously. And that left the Eldar army looking a little bit weak towards the late game. That gave Richard the momentum to push forward on round 3, presenting all of his Iron Striders as a wall across the center of the battlefield to force the entire Eldar army to engage with him before the end of the game. That made every single Eldar unit leave their deployment zone at the bottom of round 4 to prevent Richard from either using the Scorched Earth action to destroy objectives and gain himself some additional bonus points, or give him a big score on primary, which could do a lot to alleviate the pressure of the benefit of going second. Liam took that fight and ended up committing an enormous amount of his army into the center of the table, and Richard used a unit of Sicarian Ruststalkers, a unit of Infiltrators, and a unit of Taraxi that he had been keeping in his deployment zone for the entirety of the game to push forward and basically clear the entire middle of the table at the top of round 5. That put Liam into a position where the only way he could win was to draw 2 perfect secondaries, score both of them, and destroy an objective. And while he did draw enough secondaries that if he scored both of them, he would tie the game, and the game would actually go to tiebreak, which is a theoretical 6th battle round in which only primary objective control matters, Richard was barely able to survive and prevent one of those secondaries from scoring to barely edge out Liam's score at the end of the 5th battle round. An incredible showcase of playing against one of the best players in the entire world, playing one of the best army compositions in the entire world in a seat where 9 times out of 10 you are expected to lose, and still play conservatively enough to nullify the benefit of going second and win the game on round 5 anyway. An insane showcase of competitive 40k, and a clear indication of why Richard Siegler deserves to be crowned the world champion.
I already knew going into this game, we're playing on Crucible Battle, the objectives are going to be out in the open. So I have Fire and Fade, he has Fire and Fade. I'm better at killing him than he's at me. Usually he has to require multiple of his units to try and kill one of mine, whereas I can just use the Sky Stalkers and rip up his Rangers or whatever. So I knew I was going to be able to give him 5s. If he has bottom, he's going to have a little bit of an advantage with a potential 10 there and a 5 burn. So I have to make sure I get at least 110, which I did early on. He wasn't willing to trade too many units in that first turn, so I got my 10. And then if I got a burn off, I felt like 100% I was going to win. He ended up denying the burn. If he failed that 6-inch charge, which with the reroll, he almost failed it, I win on the spot as I burn that objective, and he just can't get enough points in the final turn. Going into the end of the game, I had that natural advantage, and I just had to complicate the board state. He has to make many, many perfect plays, and it just fell short for him.
If anything falls short, then it all comes apart.
Exactly.
And that is how Richard Siegler was able to take Skitarii Hunter cohort and the Adeptus Mechanicus faction to the World Championships and pilot them to victory to be crowned our World Champion. If you want to watch any of these games, you can check them out either on the official Warhammer channel or on the channel's upstreaming partners, Lavasta Horus and French Wargame. I will put links to both of those in the video description if you want to watch those games. All of the coverage over the weekend was incredible. We had a whole watch party in our Discord watching the whole thing, and many cheers were raised when Richard Siegler was able to retain the World Championship title in the United States for another year running. So let me know down in the comment section what you think about this video. Big thanks to Foldforge for sponsoring this video, and thanks to you for watching all the way through until the end. I'll be back later this week with more best armies in Warhammer 40k and with live streams covering a lot of the results we saw from the World Championships. So I'll see you over there. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.